The morning didn't warn me. That's the strange thing. Big moments in life rarely do. The sun came up the same way it always had, pale and hesitant over the Oregon coast, slipping through the thin curtains like it wasn't sure it was welcome yet. The air smelled faintly of salt and damp wood. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I had learned to live with that kind of silence. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, the one my husband and I bought secondhand almost 30 years ago. One leg still wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. I never fixed it. Some things earn the right to stay imperfect. My hands were wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, blue on the outside, white on the inside. The handle was cracked, but it held. That mug had outlived my marriage, my career, and most of the people who used to call this house home. My name is Evelyn Moore. I'm 69 years old, and until that morning, I believed my life was settled. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I built it that way on purpose. After my husband Richard died 7 years ago, I didn't crumble. I didn't scream or spiral or disappear into grief the way people expect widows to. I organized. I filed paperwork. I paid off what little remained of the mortgage. I kept my routines. People mistake calm for weakness. They mistake silence for surrender. Richard used to say, stability is just discipline done long enough. We believed in that. We weren't rich, but we were careful. No gambling, no debt we couldn't explain, no decisions made out of panic. We saved slowly, invested conservatively, and lived inside our means like it was a moral code. And it worked. After he passed, the house stayed mine, the savings stayed intact, my independence stayed non-negotiable. At least, that's what I thought. The phone buzzed once against the table. Just once. I smiled before I even looked at it. That reflex doesn't fade with age. When your child's name lights up your screen, your body reacts before your mind catches up. Daniel, my son. I expected a picture of my grandson, or a casual check-in, or one of those half-concerned, half-practical questions he'd been asking more often lately. Instead, the message was short, sharp, clean. You shouldn't expect me to take care of you when you're older. I have my own life now. That was it. No hello, no explanation, no soft landing. The words felt like they pulled the air straight out of my lungs. I stared at the screen, rereading them slowly, like maybe the meaning would change if I gave it enough time. It didn't. Behind me, the kettle began to scream. I hadn't even realized it had started boiling. The sound felt aggressive in the quiet room. I turned it off with shaking fingers and sat back down, my phone still clutched in my hand like it might explain itself if I held it long enough. I didn't cry. That surprised me. What settled in my chest wasn't sadness. It was something colder, heavier, a kind of stillness that comes when your mind stops negotiating with reality and finally accepts it. This message wasn't written in anger. It wasn't a bad moment. It wasn't stress talking. It was honesty. And honesty, when it arrives without apology, leaves a mark. I scrolled back through our recent messages, searching for a trigger, something I'd said, something I'd asked for, some sign I'd pushed too hard. 3 days earlier, we'd had dinner together. He hugged me before he left, told me to rest, told me he loved me. That's when I understood something that hurt more than the message itself. This wasn't sudden. This was planned. I thought of all the times he'd asked about my finances, about simplifying accounts, about making things easier later. I had heard concern because that was the version of my son I wanted to believe in. I thought of Richard then, of a night years ago when we sat at this same table, paper spread between us. He looked at me and said, If anyone ever makes you feel like a burden, promise me you won't beg them to stay." I had promised. My thumbs hovered over the screen for a long moment. There were 1,000 things I could have said: questions, defenses, explanations, apologies I didn't owe. Instead, I typed 2 letters: "OK." I stared at it before pressing send. Once it was gone, there would be no taking it back, no softening, no rewriting history. The phone went silent. I finished my tea, I went for my walk, I waved at my neighbor like nothing had happened. But something had. That message didn't just hurt me, it stripped away every illusion I'd been protecting. And as I walked back toward my house under a sky that suddenly felt too wide, I realized something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. If my son didn't want the responsibility of caring for me, then he didn't get to quietly benefit from what I'd spent my entire life protecting. That thought didn't make me angry. It made me clear. And clarity, I would soon learn, is the most dangerous thing a woman like me can have. After that message, nothing in my routine changed, and that's what made it unsettling. I still woke before the sun, still walked the same cracked sidewalk toward the water, still bought the same groceries and folded the same towels the same way I always had. From the outside, my life looked untouched, but inside, something had shifted, quietly, decisively. People think stability happens by accident, like you wake up one day and realize your life is calm. But calm is built, brick by brick, decision by decision, and most of those decisions aren't glamorous. I worked for 35 years as an administrative coordinator at a small private college. No corner office, no applause, just responsibility. Budgets that couldn't be wrong, records that had to be precise. People trusted me with systems that broke if you cut corners. I learned early that security isn't about big wins. It's about avoiding big mistakes. Richard understood that better than anyone. He was an electrical technician, practical, patient, methodical. We met young, struggled early, and learned together. No flashy vacations, no credit card lifestyles, just slow progress and honest effort. When Daniel was born, we made choices that weren't popular. We drove used cars. We stayed in the same modest house while others upgraded. We saved for emergencies instead of appearances. I used to tell myself we were teaching our son values. I wonder now what he actually learned. After Richard's death, I stayed busy on purpose. Grief is dangerous when it has too much space. I volunteered at a local literacy center twice a week, helped adults learn to read, to write letters, to fill out job applications. It grounded me. Those people weren't asking for handouts, they were asking for tools. I respected that. Daniel called often during those early years. He checked on me, helped organize paperwork, offered advice. At the time, I was grateful. Grief makes you reach for familiar hands. Looking back, I see how helpfulness slowly turned into oversight. Do you really need that many accounts? Wouldn't it be easier if I helped manage things? You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff at your age. At first, it sounded like care. Then it started sounding like assumption. Still, I didn't push back. Mothers are trained not to. We're taught that trust is love and questioning feels like failure. So when he asked me to add his name to one account just in case, I did. Convenience. That's the word people use when they want access without accountability. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my sister, that something felt off. I didn't even let myself think it clearly, because once you name a concern, you have to deal with it, and I wasn't ready yet.
The money requests came slowly, carefully spaced, never framed as need, always as temporary inconvenience. Just this once, just until next month, just to bridge the gap. I helped because I could, and because I believed that support flowed both ways, that family meant showing up when things got tight. But help, when it becomes expected, stops being help. It becomes entitlement. That message, "I have my own life now," echoed in my mind over and over as the days passed, not with bitterness, with clarity. If he had his own life, then I needed to make sure I still had mine. One afternoon, I opened the old filing cabinet in the hallway, the one Richard used to joke was the most organized chaos in the house. Inside were folders I hadn't touched in years. I sat on the floor and started reading, not searching, reviewing. Dates, transfers, patterns. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just enough to tell a story I hadn't wanted to hear. 4 years of temporary help, no repayment, no plan, and no acknowledgement that it had ever been help at all. That night I slept poorly, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally awake. The next morning I made a decision I didn't announce to anyone. I picked up the phone and asked for a recommendation for an attorney. Not to fight, not to accuse, to understand. Because once you understand something clearly, you can't unknow it. And I had the unsettling feeling that I was standing at the edge of a truth that would change more than just my relationship with my son. It would change how I saw myself.
The attorney's office smelled like old books and lemon polish. That was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't intimidating. No marble floors, no glass walls, just a quiet space that felt designed for listening more than impressing. The kind of place where people brought problems they didn't want repeated. Her name was Claire Whitman. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush, just listened while I explained my life the way you do when you're trying not to sound dramatic. Facts first, emotions held carefully at arm's length. I told her about Richard, about Daniel, about the accounts, the message. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked a question that surprised me. What do you want to protect? Not who, not what you're afraid of losing, not how do you want to fix your son, just what do you want to protect? My independence, I said. The answer came quicker than I expected, and the life my husband and I built. She nodded once. Then she explained something that made my stomach tighten. Small decisions, adding a name to an account, sharing passwords, offering convenience access, those were often the starting point, not of crime, of assumption, of quiet power shifts people didn't recognize until they were already happening. People rarely take control all at once, she said calmly. They ease into it, slowly enough that you feel silly questioning it. That sentence stuck, because it described my last 4 years perfectly. Claire didn't tell me to cut Daniel off. She didn't suggest confrontation or drama. She simply outlined options, how to close gaps, how to protect myself before anyone questioned my competence. Once someone suggests you might not be capable, she said calmly, the burden shifts. You don't want to be defending yourself after the fact. I left her office with a folder of information and a strange mix of emotions, relief, fear, and something I hadn't felt in a long time, authority. That afternoon, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Daniel's wife, Lena, called more often now. Her voice was gentle, practiced. She asked about my sleep, my blood pressure, whether I'd been feeling confused lately. She mentioned casually that summers could be dangerous for someone my age, suggested that assisted living down the road might be safer. I laughed it off, but the idea lingered.
That night, Daniel called. His tone was warm, almost rehearsed. He asked how I was feeling, if I'd been stressed, if I was overthinking things. I answered carefully. Then he said something small but telling. "You know I'm just trying to help, right? Help doesn't need reassurance." I hung up feeling unsettled, not because of what he said, but because of how familiar the pattern felt. Care, concern, control. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I moved quietly. I opened new accounts at a different bank, closed shared access, updated my records, scheduled a medical evaluation, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew someone else might. Claire called it proactive clarity. 3 days later, Daniel noticed. He showed up unannounced. No knock, no call. "What did you do?" he demanded, standing in my kitchen like it belonged to him. I didn't raise my voice. "I made decisions," I said, "about my own finances." His face shifted, concern melting into irritation, then something sharper. "You didn't tell me." "That's correct." He stared at me like I'd broken an unspoken rule. "You're overreacting," he said. "You always get emotional." Something closed quietly inside me then. I'm not emotional. I'm informed. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about love. This was about access. And people don't like losing access they never thought they'd have to ask for. As he left, he said one last thing. "This isn't over." I believed him.
After Daniel left that afternoon, the house felt different. Not emptier, sharper, like the walls had been listening. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, staring out at the narrow strip of yard behind the house. The wind moved through the tall grass in slow waves, bending it all in the same direction. I thought about how easily things bend when pressure is applied steadily enough. Daniel didn't call that night. He didn't text the next day either. At first, the silence felt like relief. No explaining, no defending, no pretending everything was fine. But relief has a shelf life. After a while, it turns into something else. Anticipation. Because silence from someone like Daniel wasn't peace, it was preparation. On the third day, Lena called. Her voice was soft, concerned, almost soothing. She asked how I was feeling, whether I'd been sleeping well, if the stress had been too much lately. I told her I was fine. That's when the conversation shifted. She mentioned, lightly, that sometimes people my age don't realize when they're being taken advantage of, that sudden changes could look concerning to outsiders, doctors, for example, or financial institutions. I didn't argue. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. My chest was not. That evening, Claire called me. "They reached out," she said. My stomach dropped. "About what?" "About whether you're making decisions independently." There it was. Not a question, an accusation disguised as concern. "They asked if you were confused, if you were under stress, if someone had pressured you." I closed my eyes. "And what did you say?" I asked. "That you came to me on your own," she replied, "that you were informed, composed, and clear, and that any further communication should go through my office." The quiet after that call felt heavier than before. I slept poorly. Every sound outside seemed louder than it should have been, not because I was afraid, but because I was alert. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. It wasn't from a court. Not yet. It suggested a capacity review, said it would be in everyone's best interest. I sat at the table holding the envelope for a long time. This wasn't emotional. This was procedural. They weren't asking anymore. They were laying groundwork. That afternoon, I went into the hallway closet, the one with boxes I hadn't opened since Richard died. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just following a feeling I'd learned to trust. At the bottom of one box, beneath old tax documents, was a thin folder I didn't remember labeling. Inside were printed emails between Daniel and a legal consultant, dated years ago, long before the message, long before the arguments. My hands started to tremble as I read. What options exist if a parent becomes uncooperative? How long does the process usually take? What if she becomes difficult? The room felt suddenly too small. This wasn't reaction. This was planning. I sat on the floor as the afternoon light stretched across the hallway, and something inside me broke cleanly, not into fear, but into certainty. I scanned every page, backed them up, sent copies to Claire before sunset. When she called back, her voice was steady but firm. "This changes everything," she said. "They weren't responding to your decisions. They were waiting for resistance." I looked around my quiet house, the place I had protected, the life I had built. "Then I won't just defend myself," I said. "I'll be ready." Because in that moment, I understood something deeply unsettling. The danger wasn't losing my money. The danger was losing my voice. And I had no intention of letting that happen. Once you see a plan forming around you, you can't pretend you're imagining it. That night, after I sent the emails to Claire, I didn't sleep at all. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind was finally moving in straight lines. Fear scrambles thoughts. Clarity sharpens them. By morning, I had a list. It wasn't dramatic, no revenge, no anger written between the lines, just steps, practical, quiet steps, the kind Richard and I had always believed in. I scheduled a full medical evaluation, not rushed, not defensive, thorough. I wanted a paper trail that spoke for me if I ever wasn't allowed to. I moved my remaining assets into the trust Claire had prepared. Each signature felt heavy, but right, like closing doors you suddenly realized should have never been left open. At the bank, the manager asked if I was sure. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. That afternoon, I changed the locks. Not because I was afraid Daniel would come back angry, but because access without permission is still access, and I was done confusing familiarity with entitlement. When I got home, the phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. If I answered too soon, I would soften. I knew myself well enough to admit that. Mothers are wired to de-escalate, to smooth things over, to carry discomfort so others don't have to. I wasn't doing that anymore. He left a voicemail. His voice was tight, controlled, rehearsed. "Mom, we need to talk. You're making things harder than they need to be. People are concerned." People. That word again. Not him, not family. People. As if concern came from a committee instead of his own expectations. That evening, Claire called. "They're moving quickly," she said, "but so are we." She explained what might come next. Letters, requests, possibly court involvement, not because they had evidence, but because pressure itself can force mistakes. "Stay calm," she said. "Stay consistent. Don't explain more than necessary." After we hung up, I stood in the living room and looked at the framed photo on the shelf. Richard, younger, smiling, arm around Daniel when he was still small enough to sit on his shoulders. I didn't feel anger toward my son. I felt grief.
Grief for the version of him I thought I'd raised. Grief for the future I'd assumed would come naturally. But grief doesn't mean surrender. The next morning, Daniel showed up again. This time, he knocked. Hard. I opened the door slowly. He looked different, less controlled. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless. "You can't just shut me out," he said before I could speak. "This isn't how family works." I met his gaze. "This is how boundaries work," I replied. He scoffed. "You're letting that lawyer get in your head." "No," I said quietly. "I'm listening to myself for the first time." That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. "You're going to regret this when things get hard, when you really need help." I thought of the message he'd sent me, the one that started all of this. "I already know who will show up," I said. "You told me." For a moment, his anger cracked. Then it hardened. "This isn't over," he said again. "I know," I replied, "but it's not going the way you planned." He left without another word. As I closed the door, my hands shook, not from fear, but from release. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing.
There's a special kind of exhaustion that comes from being watched, not followed, not threatened, just watched. After Daniel left that second time, the phone stopped ringing again. No calls, no messages, no apologies. The silence felt intentional now, calculated, like a pause before the next move. I stayed busy. Busy is a form of armor. I volunteered extra hours at the literacy center. I signed up for an art class at the community center, something I'd always put off because it felt indulgent. I cooked meals I didn't rush through. I slept lightly, but I slept. Still, I felt it, the sense that something was unfolding just out of view. The first sign came from someone I didn't expect. My neighbor, June, stopped me one morning while I was checking the mail. She smiled, but there was hesitation behind it. "Everything okay, Evelyn?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated. Your son mentioned you've been under a lot of stress." There it was. Daniel hadn't disappeared. He'd been talking. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain. I simply thanked her for her concern and walked back inside. But my chest tightened as I closed the door. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about narrative. 2 days later, I got a call from my primary care clinic. The receptionist was polite, professional, but cautious. "They've received a request," she said, "asking about your cognitive health." I closed my eyes. "From who?" I asked. She paused. "A family member." I told her firmly that no information was to be released without my consent. She assured me everything was documented. When I hung up, my hands shook, not because I was afraid of what they'd find, but because of what Daniel was willing to suggest. Claire confirmed it that afternoon. "They're trying to establish concern from multiple angles," she said. "Medical, social, financial." "Because concern sounds better than control," I replied. "Exactly." She told me not to panic, that this was common, that people often escalated when they realized quiet influence wasn't working. "They want you to react," she said, "to look emotional, defensive." I laughed softly. They picked the wrong woman. Still, that night, doubt crept in. Not about my decisions, about my memories. I found myself replaying moments from Daniel's childhood, searching for clues. Had I missed something? Had I pushed too hard, protected too much? But guilt is slippery like that. It tries to rewrite history when you're not looking. The next letter arrived 3 days later. This one was formal. A legal firm requesting documentation and suggesting a voluntary evaluation to avoid unnecessary proceedings. I didn't read it twice. I forwarded it to Claire. When she called back, her tone had shifted, still calm but sharper. "This is the turning point," she said. "They either back down or they push forward publicly." "And if they push forward?" I asked. "Then we let facts speak." That evening, I walked along the water as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with orange and gray. I watched families pass, children running ahead, parents calling after them. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not betrayal, transformation. Daniel wasn't becoming someone new. He was revealing who he'd always been when things didn't go his way. I stopped near the edge of the path and sat on a bench, breathing in the cool air. I thought about the life I'd built, not just the money, but the discipline, the patience, the dignity. No one was taking that from me, not quietly, not loudly, not at all. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "We can still fix this if you stop fighting." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Because some things aren't fixed by surrender. They're fixed by standing still enough for the truth to show itself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were grocery days. I had just come back from the store, arms full, mind somewhere else. The envelope was thick, cream-colored and official-looking, not threatening, not urgent. Those are the worst kind. I set the groceries down slowly and opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read Daniel's message weeks earlier. Funny how life circles back like that. This one wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was notice, a formal request for a hearing, not a trial yet, a preliminary step, a way to assess concerns and ensure appropriate oversight. Oversight. That word hit harder than anything else on the page. I wasn't being accused of a crime. I was being questioned as a person, as if my ability to exist independently was suddenly up for review. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, the kind that comes when you realize someone you love has been quietly preparing to replace your voice with theirs. I called Claire. She answered immediately. "They filed," she said after I read it aloud. "I expected this." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said calmly, "we stop dancing around it." That afternoon, I gathered everything. Every document, every bank statement, every medical record, every email I'd scanned from that old folder. I laid them out on the dining table like pieces of a puzzle I already understood. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, because once the fight is named, uncertainty loses its power. Daniel came by the next day, not angry this time, careful. He knocked politely, waited. When I opened the door, he smiled like he used to when he was younger and wanted something. "We don't have to do this," he said softly. "We can keep this private. I didn't make it public. You did." He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, looked around the living room like he was assessing damage. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Everyone's just trying to help." "Everyone?" I asked. "Or you?" His smile tightened. "You really think I'd do this to you?" he asked. "I'm your son, and I'm your mother, not your asset." That's when his tone changed. "You can't protect me if you shut me out." I met his eyes. "I already told you you wouldn't." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just looked exposed. The mask slipped for half a second, enough for me to see panic underneath the confidence. "You don't understand what you're risking," he said quietly.
I understand exactly what I'm protecting, I replied. He left without another word. The days leading up to the hearing moved slowly, too slowly. Friends checked in, some awkwardly, some cautiously. A few asked questions I didn't answer, not because I was hiding, but because explanations invite debate, and I wasn't interested in defending my sanity to people who hadn't lived my life. Claire prepared me carefully. Stay factual, she said. Stay calm. Let them talk themselves into revealing more than they intend. I practiced answers in my head, not emotional ones, clear ones. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed simply. Neutral colors, comfortable shoes, hair neat, no jewelry that might be read as vanity or sentimentality. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just showing up as myself. The building was colder than I expected. Not just the air, the energy, sterile, detached, designed to strip emotion from the room. Daniel sat across from me with Lena beside him. She avoided my eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he did well, too well. He talked about concern, about stress, about wanting the best for me, about protecting family assets. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. I didn't mention betrayal. I didn't mention pain. I talked about facts, my work history, my routines, my finances, my health. I answered every question directly, no hesitation, no confusion. Then Claire introduced the emails. The room shifted. Daniel's attorney tried to reframe them, hypothetical, misunderstood, taken out of context. But words have weight when they're written before conflict ever begins. What if she becomes difficult? That sentence changed everything. The panel asked Daniel to respond. He couldn't. The silence stretched. I watched his face as realization hit him, not that he might lose, but that he had been seen. When the hearing ended, no decision was announced yet, but the air felt different, lighter. Outside, Daniel finally looked at me. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him. I didn't do this. I stopped pretending. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. Because no matter what happened next, the truth was finally standing where it belonged, out in the open, where it couldn't be quietly rearranged anymore.
The days after the hearing moved strangely. Not fast, not slow, suspended. I went back to my routines, but they felt altered, like furniture shifted an inch to the left, familiar, yet off. The world hadn't stopped, but it had tilted just enough that I noticed every step. People treated me differently now, not openly, not unkindly, just carefully. At the literacy center, one of the volunteers asked if I was feeling okay before handing me a stack of forms. At the grocery store, June asked, again, if I needed help carrying my bags, even though she'd never done that before. Concern spreads faster than truth. Daniel hadn't called. Neither had Lena. The silence felt heavier this time, not strategic, wounded. Claire warned me this would happen. When people lose control, she said, they often retreat before they regroup. The official decision arrived by mail a week later. Petition denied. No finding of incapacity, no recommendation for oversight, no further action required, just facts. I sat at the table and read it twice, then placed it neatly into a folder with the rest of the paperwork. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. I felt steady. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by. He didn't knock this time. He stood at the end of the driveway like he wasn't sure he was allowed to approach. I walked out to meet him. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, like something he'd been leaning on had collapsed without warning. "They denied it," he said. "Yes," I replied. "They didn't understand," he added quickly. "They didn't see what I was trying to do." "I think they saw exactly enough," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. His voice dropped. "You could have stopped this," he said. "You could have talked to me." "I did," I replied. "You just didn't like what I said." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "So, what happens now?" I looked at him, really looked at him, not as my son, not as a child I'd protected, but as a man responsible for his choices. "It depends on you," I said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said slowly, "if you want a relationship, it can't be built on access, expectation, or pressure, only respect." He scoffed lightly. "You're punishing me." "No," I said, "I'm stopping the punishment of myself." That landed harder than I expected. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained from him, leaving something raw behind. "I was just trying to make sure things didn't fall apart," he muttered. "They weren't falling apart. You were just tired of waiting." That's when the truth finally surfaced, not as an argument, but as a confession. He admitted the pressure, the debt, the fear of failing, the way my stability had begun to feel like a safety net he could reach for without asking. "I didn't think you'd push back," he said quietly. "I didn't think I'd have to." We stood there, the wind moving through the trees between us. I felt sadness then, deep and clean, not because I'd lost him, but because I finally understood him. "I need time," he said. "So do I." He left without touching me. That night, I sat on my porch long after the sky went dark. The air was cool, calm. I listened to the distant sound of waves and thought about how strength doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like standing still. I didn't know what the future held. I still don't. But for the first time in a long while, the future felt like something I owned again. After that conversation in the driveway, Daniel disappeared again. This time, the silence felt different. Not tactical, not threatening, just empty. Days passed, then weeks. No calls, no messages, no updates filtered through neighbors or mutual acquaintances. It was as if he had stepped out of my life the same way someone steps out of a room they don't know how to be in anymore. At first, I kept expecting the phone to ring. Old habits die slowly. But as time went on, I noticed something unexpected. My body began to relax. Not all at once, gradually, like a knot loosening that I hadn't realized I was carrying. My shoulders stopped tensing every time my phone buzzed. My thoughts stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. I started sleeping through the night. I returned fully to my routines, not as distractions this time, but as choices. Morning walks felt grounding again. The literacy center felt purposeful, not just busy. I finished paintings in my art class that surprised me with their softness. People noticed. "You seem lighter," June said one afternoon as we walked back from the mailbox together. I smiled. "I feel quieter." Quiet isn't empty when it's chosen. I finalized the last details of the trust with Claire, not hurried, thoughtful. I made decisions slowly, deliberately. Scholarships, community programs, causes that reflected the life Richard and I had lived. Not flashy, but meaningful. None of it was done out of anger. That mattered to me. One evening, as I sorted through an old box of photographs, I found a picture of Daniel at 10 years old, grinning, missing teeth, arms thrown wide like the world was something he trusted. I sat with that photo for a long time. Grief returned then, not sharp, but familiar. We don't just grieve people when they die. We grieve who they were. We grieve who we thought they'd become. I allowed myself that grief without judgment, but I didn't let it rewrite my boundaries. Months passed. Life didn't magically become perfect. Some evenings were still lonely. Some mornings carried questions with no answers. But the fear, the constant edge, was gone. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I had chosen peace. One afternoon, Claire called just to check in. No legal updates, no warnings, just a human call. "You did well," she said. "Most people don't." "Why?" I asked. "Because choosing dignity often means disappointing people who benefited from your silence." I thought about that long after we hung up. That night I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with pink and gray. I listened to the waves and felt the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For the first time, I didn't wonder what Daniel was thinking. I wondered what I wanted next. And that question, quiet, open, unafraid, felt like the beginning of something new. It was almost a year after the hearing when the letter arrived. Not certified, not legal, just a plain white envelope with Daniel's handwriting on the front. I recognized it instantly, that uneven slant, the way he always pressed too hard with the pen, like he was trying to make his words permanent. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the entry table for hours while I went about my day. I made tea, I watered the plants, I folded laundry slowly, deliberately, not because I was afraid, but because I refused to let anticipation control me again. By the time the sun dipped low, I was ready. The letter was longer than I expected. No anger, no accusations, no demands, just truth. He wrote about the pressure he'd been under, about debts he hadn't told me about the way my stability had started to feel like a solution instead of a relationship. He admitted, without excuses, that he'd convinced himself he was planning ahead when he was really trying to secure control. "I didn't think you'd stand up to me," he wrote, "and when you did, I panicked." That sentence sat heavy in my chest. He wrote about therapy, about realizing how entitlement had disguised itself as responsibility, about shame, real shame, not the performative kind meant to soften consequences. At the end, he didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for access. He asked for a conversation. I folded the letter carefully and set it down. That night, I slept deeply. In the morning, I wrote back. Not a long letter, not emotional, honest. I told him I was willing to talk, but only if it was about accountability, not repair, about understanding, not erasing the past. Weeks later, we met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. He looked different, older, tired in a way that comes from reflection, not stress. He didn't reach for me when he saw me. He waited. That mattered. We talked for hours, not about money, not about legalities, about fear, about expectations, about the stories we tell ourselves to justify what we want. At one point, he looked at me and said, "I thought being your son meant I'd always come first, and I thought being your mother meant I'd always come last." We sat with that. When we parted, nothing was fixed, but something was honest. And honesty, real honesty, doesn't promise reunion. It promises clarity. As I drove home, I felt something close to peace settle back in. Not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer hidden. After that meeting, Daniel didn't disappear again, but he didn't rush back either. That was new. Our communication became slow and intentional. Short messages, occasional check-ins. No assumptions, no expectations layered underneath the words.
For the first time in years, every interaction felt clean. He didn't ask about my finances, didn't offer suggestions, didn't frame concern as authority. That silence around money spoke louder than any apology. Months passed like that. I noticed the shift not in what he said, but in what he didn't try to take. No leverage, no pressure, no rewriting of history. That, to me, was accountability. I continued building my life outward instead of inward. The Literacy Center expanded its program, and I helped train new volunteers. My art class turned into a small circle of friends who met for coffee after sessions, laughing about mistakes and comparing brushstrokes like children rediscovering play. Joy came back quietly. One afternoon, Daniel called and asked if he could stop by. Not needed to, not was in the area, asked. That mattered. When he arrived, he stood in the doorway like a guest, waited to be invited in. I noticed that too. We sat in the living room with tea between us. The house felt familiar, but not charged. He said, "I wanted you to know I closed the accounts I was using your name for. I'm handling things on my own now." I nodded. "He didn't do it for you," he added quickly. "I did it because I needed to." "That's the only reason that counts," I replied. He hesitated. "I know things can't go back." "No," I said gently, "they can't." That didn't flinch him. He stayed for an hour, talked about work, about therapy, about learning how fear can turn into control when you don't face it. When he left, I felt something close to hope, but quieter. Hope without entitlement. Later that week, I finalized the last portion of my estate planning. Everything was clear, documented, protected. Not to punish, to prevent confusion. I told Daniel about it, not the details, just the existence. He didn't ask questions. He said, "I trust you." That was the moment I knew something had truly changed. Trust this time wasn't about access, it was about restraint. That night, I sat on the porch as the stars came out one by one. I thought about how many years I'd spent believing love meant endless giving. I see now that love also means knowing when to stop, because what survives boundaries is real, and what doesn't was never meant to.
There's a moment after the noise fades when you finally hear your own life again. That's what this season felt like. Not empty, not triumphant, just honest. I began noticing the small things, the kind that slip past you when you're living defensively, the way morning light stretched across the floor, the comfort of familiar silence that didn't demand anything from me, the satisfaction of choosing how my time was spent instead of reacting to someone else's urgency. I started sorting through old belongings, not out of sadness, but clarity. Richard's tools stayed where they were, his sweaters neatly folded. Some memories aren't meant to be minimized, they're meant to be respected. I donated what no longer served me, gave away what could help someone else, not in a rush, never in a rush. Legacy, I realized, isn't about what you leave behind, it's about what you refuse to let be taken. Daniel continued to show up, in small ways, a text asking how my day was, a call just to share something ordinary. He never asked for advice unless I offered it, never crossed a line. That restraint was louder than apology. One afternoon, my grandson sent me a drawing in the mail, a crooked house, a stick figure labeled Grandma. I taped it to the refrigerator and stood there smiling longer than I meant to. Love still existed. It had just changed shape. At the Literacy Center, a woman I'd been tutoring finally read her first full page aloud without stopping. She cried. I cried. That moment felt like inheritance, too, passing something forward without strings attached. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years.
not to process pain, to record peace. I wrote about choosing dignity, about how boundaries didn't shrink my world, they defined it, about how silence, when it's chosen, can be a form of power. I slept deeply that night, and when I woke, I felt something settle gently into place. Acceptance. Not forgiveness, not forgetting. Acceptance of what was, and gratitude for what still is. Time doesn't heal everything. That's something people say because it sounds comforting. What time actually does is soften the sharp edges. It gives you space to set things down that were never meant to be carried forever. It doesn't erase the past, it teaches you how to live beside it. This season of my life felt like that, a coexistence. Daniel and I found a rhythm that didn't require explanation. We spoke when there was something to say. We respected silence when there wasn't. There were no forced holidays, no staged family moments meant to prove something to the outside world, just honesty. One afternoon, he came over to help me move a bookshelf, a small thing, practical. We worked side by side without tension, without walking on invisible glass. At one point, he paused, holding the shelf steady, and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you'd already given up for us." I didn't respond right away, because acknowledgement doesn't always need an answer. Later, after he left, I sat in the living room and thought about the versions of myself I'd been over the years, the young woman building a life carefully, the wife holding things together, the mother believing love meant endless patience, the widow learning how to stand alone again. Each version had done the best she could with what she knew at the time. That mattered. I stopped blaming my past self for not seeing things sooner. Awareness doesn't arrive on schedule. It arrives when you're ready to survive it. The trust documents were finalized. The plans were clear. There was no confusion left to exploit. That gave me a deep, quiet comfort, not because I feared the future, but because I respected it. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the horizon darken, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for approval, not for reassurance. I had stopped measuring my life by what others did with it. That was closure. Not a conversation, not an apology, a decision. Some endings don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with speeches or forgiveness scenes or neatly tied bows. They come quietly, like a door you stop trying to open because you finally understand what's on the other side. That's how this ending came to me. One evening, long after summer had faded into cooler days, I sat alone in the living room with only a lamp on. The house felt calm in a way I hadn't known before, not protected, not guarded, just calm. I realized I wasn't replaying old conversations anymore. I wasn't bracing myself when the phone rang. I wasn't measuring my worth by how useful I was to someone else. I had stopped shrinking. That was the real change. Daniel and I never returned to what we were before, and that was okay. What we found instead was something more honest, smaller, slower, built on consent instead of obligation. He learned to stand on his own. I learned I already was. Sometimes we shared a meal, sometimes weeks passed without contact. Neither of us panicked anymore. Love no longer felt like a debt being collected. It felt like a choice. I finished my plans quietly. My life, my work, my resources, all directed with intention, not to punish anyone, not to prove anything, but to reflect who I was. A woman who believed dignity mattered. A woman who understood that generosity without boundaries becomes self-erasure. A woman who learned late but fully that peace is something you defend. One morning, as I walked along the water, the air cool and steady, I stopped and watched the tide roll in. No force, no rush, just movement. That's what strength looks like when it matures. Not loud, not angry, unshakable. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I know this. I will not spend it begging to be valued. I will not confuse love with access. And I will never again mistake silence for safety. The life I built survived because I finally chose to stand inside it fully, unapologetically, and awake. And that choice, that was mine. If this story touched you, please don't scroll away just yet. Take a moment. Breathe. Some stories aren't meant to be rushed past. They're meant to sit with you. If you've ever felt taken for granted, if you've ever stayed silent to keep the peace, if you've ever confused love with obligation, then this story was for you. Like this video if you believe dignity matters at every age. Subscribe if you want more deep, calm, real-life stories like this one. Share this story with someone who might be struggling to choose themselves. And I want to ask you something. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it the silence, the boundaries, or the moment she finally chose herself? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're watching from because your voice matters here. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening. And remember, choosing yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it's survival.